You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 91. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sarah Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
In this episode, we want to help you as a Jesus follower become all who God created you to be, who makes an impact on your corner of the world. And we know that to do that, you need to lead with courage.
So before we jump into what we mean by lead, let me remind you that this episode of LeaderCast is brought to you by Dare to Lead, a training experience for Christian leaders to learn the skills you need to be a brave leader and create a courageous culture at church, at home, and in the workplace. It's one way Transforming Mission helps Jesus followers become courageous leaders and become the person that God created you to be. You can find resources for this episode, including a transformation guide, at transformingmission.org/091. Did you know that when you become a LeaderCast Insider, you're the first to know when a new episode is available, and that you automatically receive the transformation guides? Become a LeaderCast Insider, and every Tuesday morning you'll receive an email with the link to the new episode and the transformation guide. Once again, you can find resources and a link to sign up to become a LeaderCast Insider at transformingmission.org/091.
Sarah, as we start this episode, why don't you give us a definition of leadership?
Tim, I'm sure that you have heard many definitions of leadership, and for me, they all seem to fall short. The definition that I have been working with, and I think embodies it beautifully, comes from Brené Brown, and how she talks about leaders is that a leader is anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes, and who has the courage to develop that potential.
So with that definition seems to me that that's not necessarily a position, but maybe parents could be leaders, or little league coaches, or just any of us could be leaders at any situation, circumstance we find ourselves.
Yeah, and we'll get into the challenges of thinking that leadership is only about the position that you are holding in just a minute. But how I have written about it is that you can be a leader as a parent, you can be a leader as a spouse, you can be in the boardroom, or you can be in a laundry room, you could be on a baseball diamond, or you might be in a Starbucks coffee line, helping to guide people through that. You might be in a classroom or a courtroom or anywhere in between. In all of those places, and in many more places, the world needs brave and daring leaders, not only leaders who have faith, but who practice that faith.
So as Jesus followers, to become all that God would have us to be, to have an impact on our corner of the world, what you're saying is we can be leaders.
Yeah, and I think the question is, are you a leader? Given that definition as anyone who's taking responsibility for finding the potential in people or processes and has the courage to develop that potential, are you a leader? And I think that's one of the challenges that we run into, is that we because, as you indicated, we view leadership as a position. So let's go back to that school. You think that the only leader in the school is the principal or the vice principal because they're in a position of where they have the responsibility to lead. And the reality is there are teachers in that school that are leading. There's likely a custodian who is leading in that school. There are students who are leading in that school because they're taking responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes. Contrast that with someone who's in a positional leadership role, and their primary motivation, and they wouldn't come out and say this, but you can see it in the way that they act, in the words that they say, in what they focus on, is about either receiving recognition because they are the leader. So being recognized for being a leader is their primary motivation, or they're dictating what is happening, and telling people what to do is not leadership. So in another episode, we'll talk more about helping you to discern, are you really a leader? But with that definition in mind, and thinking about some of the challenges that we face as people of faith seeking to lead, Tim, what are some of the things that you're thinking about in terms of those challenges?
Well, just as you're talking about, one of the challenges is that just because you hold a position doesn't make you a leader. But one of the things that I'm hearing you say that kind of resonates with me is that some of the greatest leaders we might have are parents. Because what they're doing is, whether parents realize it or not, they're actually leading someone who's going to be leading the rest of us sometime in the future.
Right.
So it's not necessarily a position, a certificate, a job. It is becoming who God created us to be for that moment in time in history with the people we have responsibility.
Yes.
So one of the challenges then is that it's more than position. So if we just limit it to position, then we're beginning to limit what leadership really is.
And again, we'll get into this more in another episode, but not everyone needs to be a leader. So it's okay to say, no, I am not a leader. There are some places that we find ourselves, and I think you just hit a very important one, Tim. As a parent, you're going to need to lead your kids. They need to look to you as someone who's, one, taking responsibility for them. After all, they are children, right? Two, finding the potential in them. And then three, who has the courage to develop that potential. What an amazing responsibility and gift to be able to step into. Leadership, I want you to hear us loud and clear. You may be in a positional role, but that does not make you a leader. What makes you a leader is, are you taking responsibility? Are you looking for the potential in people and in processes? And then are you seeking to develop that potential and having the courage to do so? Because that's where the hard work comes in, is developing the potential that you see in other people and in the processes.
So when you talk about the hard work, another thing I think about that you and I've talked about on more than one occasion is vicarious spirituality, or because somebody else is doing it, and I say, look what we're doing, because I'm trying to live through someone else.
So the example that I think of comes from the local church on this one, that in local churches where the congregation is paying staff to do ministry. And so let's say you have a missions pastor, and because the missions pastor is taking people to serve in the city, now you are serving in the city and you're taking responsibility for that, but you're not doing a darn thing. You aren't participating in the ministry in any way. You aren't helping to coordinate the ministry in any way. You certainly aren't serving as a leader with other people, helping them to experience that. You're not even giving money, and yet you're claiming it as a ministry. Now, that's different than saying our church is a part of. But Tim, you and I both know people who have said, oh yeah, I'm, and they use the word I'm involved in missions because they're a part of an organization called the church that has that ministry that is in the church. That's vicarious spirituality. And that is not leadership. I won't say what it is.
Let me, not to spend too much time talking about the church, but part of, I think, part of the anxiety we have within our system at this point is that there are many churches, many congregations that feel like that if they just had the right leader, talking about the pastoral leader, then they could do the things they need to do. What's behind that isn't the giftedness of the leader, but is the idea that if we had somebody to do it for us, then we'd be doing what we need to do.
Right.
That's the vicarious leadership.
And it plays out in every sphere of life. I mean, I've heard that said about teachers. I've heard it said about college professors. I've heard it said about presidents of universities. I've heard it said about local community leaders, governors of the state, all the way up to President of the United States and everywhere in between. And I think that's the place that if you are truly a leader, you aren't pointing your finger at other people. You're asking the question, what's my responsibility here? And how am I developing the potential in people, in processes, and stepping into that with courage?
So we'll go one more, and that is, I can talk a good game of golf. Of course, when I'm on the golf course, the worms wear hard hats. But I live vicariously. I live vicariously through Tiger Woods. I can get real excited about golf when I'm watching him play. But there's nothing about my golf game that comes even close. I mean, I do use golf clubs, but that's about as close as I come to what Tiger Woods does. Another place that we might talk about vicarious kind of spirituality or leadership is right now in terms of the time of year that we're in and college football. We've got thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people that gather into football stadiums and they talk about, we won that game, and all they're doing is sitting in the stands. It may be that we'll have another thing to say about that in a few minutes, but there are people on the field playing, but we won the game.
So turn the table just a bit, because if you are leading and you are developing the potential in people, and if you are stepping into courageous leadership, seeking to develop that potential, it's likely that you're going to get criticized. There's going to be someone or a group of people that don't like that you are leading people for their lives to be transformed. That's how I would say it. And so sometimes there are people who, just to keep playing with that arena metaphor, who are sitting in the cheap seats. And sometimes there are people that are the season ticket holders. And the people in the cheap seats are always going to have an opinion. And the people that are the season ticket holders are always going to try and preserve the status quo. And I have been in many places of leadership where I wish that I had that language to be able to acknowledge the people that were the season ticket holders and acknowledge the people sitting in the cheap seats, but not get pulled into the drama and the opinions that they were seeding in the culture that I was trying to lead change.
So those are some of the challenges. How are we going to address those challenges? So here we're talking about leading with courage. You have a story or a part of your life that helps us step into this in a different way.
Yeah, just a couple weeks ago, I was having a conversation with someone, and they said to me, Sarah, with everything that's happening in the life of the church, everything that's happening in the culture that we're living in, where things seem to be much more polarized and opinionated, and you're coaching pastors, how do you stay healthy and how do you stay grounded? And I just kind of laughed because it was someone at an event that I was speaking at, and I was speaking about this very thing, and I said, and they had heard me give this talk before, and I said, well, when I talk about understanding what your purpose is, and when I talk about paying attention to God's presence, and that all begins with the scriptures, that's a part of who I am. And so I keep my feet grounded by understanding that my purpose and God's presence set the foundation for the relationships that I'm in the midst of. And I'm not going to get emotionally hooked by the drama or challenges or even the experience or the expression of someone that I'm coaching. I can stand at a distance from that and be in a place of empathy when they're frustrated or mad about something, of course, but I don't take that on.
I'm going to project a little here. Part of the reason you don't take that on is that you have a clear understanding of your purpose. You know why you're doing what you're doing. You've got an intentional way of recognizing God in the midst of all of if it's chaos or emotional intensity, but you can see where God is in the midst of that, and that the relationship you have not only with the people that you're coaching, but even in a larger sense, are all things that help keep a focus on helping people become more who God would have them be. If you weren't sure of who God was shaping Sarah Thomas to be, you would have more difficulty with that. Or if you weren't aware that God was in the midst of shaping somebody else who may be having some anxiety about something, you would do something different than that. So part of it is, I'm going to say it this way, it's because you're healthy that you're able to step into the middle of that.
Yeah, and I really think that it comes from that first thing that you said around purpose. My purpose isn't to solve anybody's problem. My purpose is not to be the hero of their story. My purpose isn't to fix what is happening. My purpose is to come alongside a leader and help them continue to grow and help them step into that place of courage and identify maybe why they're not. And maybe what has worked in the past that they can step in, that they can learn from, and then step into that place of courage. And so at a very foundational level, I don't approach what I'm doing as, let's say a doctor may approach a patient wanting to solve the mystery of a disease. It's not for me to solve. It's for me to partner with someone. And so I am very clear on what my purpose is in that role as a coach. And that's where, as a leader, as we step into more of what we're going to talk about today, if you're not clear about your purpose, you're going to have a hard time making decisions about things. Just take that example. If I thought that my purpose as a coach was to tell people what to do, I could get frustrated if they don't do what I tell them to do, right?
Right.
But that's not my purpose, and that's not coaching.
We've got some things to offer people today to help them grow into who God would have them be, especially as they would lead with courage. So what are some of the things that we have?
Yeah, so we've already said it through the example that I've offered. But remember your purpose. That's the first one. And if you need a reminder of that, head back to episode 88. So transformingmission.org/088. And then in episode 89, we talked about focusing in on God's presence. Again, God's purpose and God's presence set the foundation for everything that you're going to do as a leader. And then in episode 90, last week, we talked about developing courageous relationships and how do we interact with people and invest in those relationships. So today, the fourth piece of that is really stepping into leading with courage and leading from your place of giftedness, leading from the place of who God has created you to be, not what you see in someone else, not what someone else has expectations of you, but how has God wired you to live and lead? And so there may be some of you, based on the definition that we've given, that you might not feel like a leader. And again, that's absolutely okay. Not everyone is a leader. Look for that in a future episode. There are some of you, though, who are leaders. And when I read that definition, a leader being someone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes and who have the courage to develop that potential, you thought, that's not what I'm doing. That's not how I'm leading. And so we want to give you 4 things today that will help you step into leading in that way. And we're not going to unpack them in their fullness, but you can join us starting in January if you're local to Columbus for a series of workshops that we're going to do that will help you to learn how to do these things well in the context and in the place that God has sent you to lead.
So we got 4 of them. What's the first one?
The first one is rumbling with vulnerability.
Would you? We've done this before, but would you give us a definition or an idea of what you mean by rumbling?
Yeah, and let me first start by telling you what rumbling is not. Rumbling is not about what you may have heard. I can't remember now if it was boxing or if it was wrestling. And the announcer would call out, "Are you ready to rumble?" This isn't about a boxing match or a wrestling match. It's about how you show up. And it's a phrase to be used that triggers for people a set of expectations and sets the intention of having a conversation, a discussion, a meeting, whatever it may be, that is set by the commitment of everyone that's involved in the conversation or discussion, with a commitment to lean in to vulnerability, to stay curious, to be generous in what's happening around the table or over the phone, to stick with what's going on when it gets messy in the middle, and to hit the pause button if you need to hit the pause button. So it's really about saying to someone else, we need to have a conversation. And it might be tough, it might be difficult, it might even be awkward. But the intention that you're setting in that is that you're going to show up and be open to the conversation that needs to happen.
So vulnerability is as much a part of what you've just talked about as the rumbling. So we're not focusing on the rumbling as much as the vulnerability.
Exactly. Rumbling with vulnerability is just a way to say we need to have a conversation that may be difficult, and it's going to require us to show up in a place and from a place of vulnerability. And we've done several episodes asking the question of how do you know if you're ready to rumble? What does it mean to rumble? And so we'll list and links to those on the show notes page that if you need to go back to or want to go back to and listen to those, you can do so.
Sarah, as I listen to this again, it is extremely important that we work on healthy relationships if we're going to rumble with vulnerability, because it's in relationship that we're able to take the risk of the vulnerability.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as we've built upon each of the things, those relationships, courageous relationships, are important for the conversation to move forward. So what's the second one?
The second one is living into your values. And what we mean by that is not that you've created a poster that you have hung on your wall, but that you have identified the values through which you are making decisions. And so, Tim, as you and I have talked about the foundation of our life as leaders and leading people being about understanding God's purpose and God's presence, I would say that in some way, those two things need to be captured in your values if you're going to be a faithful leader. And I mean faithful in every sense that you can take it, that you need to get clear on what you value. And again, we've done an episode on this that you can go back to and listen to. And as part of that, Tim, I know you identified a couple of your values. I identified a couple of my values. And part of what I have noticed since I did that exercise is that it not only helps me to make decisions, it helps me to recognize why am I so frustrated right now? So my two values I came up with that I identified are integrity and love. And so I can get really frustrated when I see a lack of integrity, that what you are saying and what you are doing and what the thoughts that are being communicated are not in alignment. I can get frustrated. I now understand why I get frustrated. And that allows me then, I'm going to go back to rumbling with vulnerability, to step into a place where I'm using some of the rumbling skills by saying, okay, hang on. Because the story I'm telling myself is, or what I hear you saying is, but what I'm seeing is, so help me understand. I can get curious then in that moment because I recognize why I am reacting emotionally to something, and I know what that's about now. It's about a contradiction in my values. And so when we're aware of that as a leader, we can step into the hard conversations and lead with courage. When we're not clear about that, it's going to be hard. And it's really going to be hard to be vulnerable because I'm not clear about where I'm leading from. I can say to someone, I just want to offer to you that one of my core values is, and I might not say it exactly like that. So something that's important to me is that we communicate with love. And I'm not hearing an ethos of love coming out of your mouth right now. Can you help me understand what you're really trying to communicate? And what happens in those moments often is someone will say, well, I don't know why you don't hear love. What are you hearing? And I'll say, I'm hearing passion, but not passionate love. I'm hearing frustration. I'm hearing dominance. And then they take a step back and go, oh, well, that's how I express love. Now I have just learned something about another person. My lens, I'm interpreting it in a completely different way than what they intended, and they learned something about themselves. And it's a win-win for both of us, because when we find ourselves in that moment again, what we can then say is, this is because you really care. And I might even say it's love. And they'll likely smile and go, yeah, you're exactly right. You see how it begins to build it. It builds on what we've been talking about, and it builds relationships and it deepens relationships. But those aren't always easy conversations to have. And that's why we keep going back to the courage piece, is you have to be willing to step into it. And the 4 skills that we're walking through, the first being rumbling with vulnerability, the second was about living your values. We'll get to 2 more in a second. You can learn how to do all of those things. So courage isn't something you have or you don't have. You were born with or you didn't. It's a part of your DNA, or mama had it or daddy didn't. You can learn these things, and they can be observed, and you can measure them. So I say that to say there's hope for all of us.
So before we move to the third one, it strikes me that even if you don't feel like you're a leader, these 4 characteristics or 4 activities that we're talking about help you become more who you were created to be. So it's not necessarily tied to leadership as much as it is to being who you can really be. Now, you can use them for leadership, but if you use them in a way of just growing in your own personhood and faith, you'll become a better human being. What's number 3?
And I would say it's slightly different, Tim. I think you will become more like Jesus. Because and we'll get into this, maybe not today, but when I look at the life of Jesus, there is courage everywhere. And if we're going to call ourselves people of faith and followers of Jesus, following Jesus necessitates courage, whether you are leading other people in that or not.
Well, before you can be a leader, you got to be a follower. And if you're going to follow Jesus, can't beat being like him.
So are we ready for the third skill?
I think we are.
The third skill is braving trust. And braving is actually an acronym. There are seven pieces around braving trust. What I'm going to say about this one is that trust and vulnerability are 2 sides of the same coin. One of the myths is that you have to have trust before you can be vulnerable. And I tell people, no, you need to be willing to step into rumbling with vulnerability if you want to grow trust. And if you want to grow trust, you're going to have to be vulnerable. They're 2 sides to the same coin. You need vulnerability to trust, and you need trust to be vulnerable.
Okay, what's number 4?
The last one is learning to rise. And this is where, as leaders, we have all had those moments or seasons that feel like, why am I doing this? We're getting beat up, you're getting criticized, you're getting knocked down. And how I like to think about it, no, let me rephrase that. I don't like to think about it this way, but how I do think about it is standing with Jesus on Good Friday at the cross. The skill of learning to rise is recognizing and claiming that we don't live on Good Friday. We are Easter people. And yes, we experience Friday and we experience the silence of Saturday, but Sunday brings resurrection. And learning to rise is about claiming that reality and learning how to stand back up after you've been knocked down, learning how to step into what I was talking about when I was talking about the values, that when I start to feel my stomach start to churn and my mind start to race and I'm preparing to react to something because I'm frustrated, I now recognize what is happening inside of me, and I now know how to respond to that so that I can rise. That it's not about reacting to someone else or reacting to my emotions. It's about recognizing them and stepping into that with courage and going, oh crap, that's where that's, I know exactly why that's bubbling up again. And when it's not just a day-to-day conversation, but it's a season of your life and you are learning how to journey through that to a new place, to keep your eyes and your heart centered on Jesus and the resurrection and the power of the new life that comes from that.
So how cool is it that we could live our lives in such a way that when we feel like that we have no place else to go, we're at the end, it couldn't be any more painful that there's a new day, and that we can rise above what we've been through. And it's not really our power, but it's the power of God through Jesus Christ that gets us to that point. That is, what could be any greater, whether it's leadership or just becoming who God would have us be, to live in that kind of assurance?
Isn't that the hope that we have as people of faith?
And that's also the hope we keep trying to help people live into and develop systems and the whole process of helping others live into it. That's why we do this podcast. That's why there's Transforming Mission.
So we've given you these 4 skills somewhat as a teaser to help you know what would be coming if you join us starting in January for one of the Dare to Lead workshops that will begin here in Columbus in January, but also so that you have a framework to begin thinking about. Do you have a firm foundation set? Do you understand how God's working in your life and how God's showing up and what your purpose is? That's the foundation. Are you recognizing the relationships that are in your midst, and then the skills that you need to be a courageous leader? And the answer for each one of us is we might recognize that we need those things, but none of us have that perfectly set out. The goal here isn't to get this perfect, folks. The goal is that you're stepping into it and taking one step and growing a little bit more each day, so that, as Tim has said multiple times, you can become the person that God has created you to be. We would love to help you continue doing that starting in January at one of the workshops here locally in Columbus. And so you can sign up on the show notes page for that. Or maybe you're just ready to take a next step in exploring the 4 things that we walked through today. And if that's the case, you can download the transformation guide and walk through the questions that we've posed for you there to help you take a moment to reflect on your own life and your leadership.
Sarah, let me ask you, these times that we'll have together after the first of the year, are they open to everyone?
Yes.
So you don't have to be a leader to be a part of it.
You do not have to be in a position of leadership.
That's where I was going.
To be a part of these workshops. I would say the focus is going to be on leadership. And so if you don't have a desire to grow as a leader or step into leadership, again, I'm not talking about positional leadership. You might be needing to lead your children in your home. You might need to be leading relationships, family, your community, a place that you volunteer. You might be... Tim and I were talking about this over a meal. You might be currently serving on the wait staff at a restaurant and have dreams of leading others in serving tables. Yes, it's open to anyone.
So another thing that we've talked about today as we bring this episode to a close is that we've actually been talking about adaptive and transformational leadership. So we're not talking about a tactical kind of leadership. We're actually talking about being able to step in to situations and circumstances of our lives and be who God would have us be at any given moment in time to help others find their way into God's loving embrace. Right?
Yeah, and so if you find yourself living in that place of vicarious spirituality, or if you find yourself recognizing that, yeah, you're a positional leader and you're not quite sure if you are truly leading in ways that both reflect courage and or embody courage. If those are the current reality for you, you can continue doing exactly what you've been doing. The only question that I might ask is it working? And the reality that I see around me, every place from the restaurants that I might eat at, the doctor's offices that I go to, the schools that I might visit, and yes, to the church, and everywhere in between, the world needs a different form of leader. And our hope and prayer is that you would have the courage to step into rumbling with vulnerability, braving trust, living your values, and learning to rise so that the people around you and the people that you're responsible for leading come to experience and see a whole new way of leadership.
Thank you, Sarah, for leading us through this time of leading with courage.
So all that I have left to say is you can find show notes for this episode at transformingmission.org/091. You can also sign up to be a part of the Dare to Lead workshops starting in January on the show notes page, or download the transformation guide. Let me ask you this. What's your next step to becoming a courageous leader? Is it signing up for the workshop? Is it downloading the transformation guide? Or maybe it's going back and listening to a previous episode to get clear about what does it mean to rumble with vulnerability. Wherever God is leading you in this season of life and leadership, our hope and prayer continues to be that you will go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.